Welcome to Restoria. I'm Edward, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story ease you into sleep. The Beekeeper's last summer. The jar had been sitting on the kitchen windowsill for so long that Clara had stopped seeing it. That happens with things you love. They become part of the air around you, part of the light. You stop looking at them the way you looked the first time, and instead they just exist quietly in the way that familiar things do. The jar of honey had been there since her grandmother filled it. Since the summer, Clara was 9 years old, standing barefoot on warm flagstone in a farmhouse kitchen, watching old hands move slowly and without hurry. She was 43 now. The farmhouse was hers. Had been for 3 years, ever since the solicitor's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, thin and white and completely unexpected. Her grandmother, Edith, had left it to her. Not to Clara's mother, not split between the cousins, not sold off to cover costs. Just left, whole and quiet, to Clara, like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. She hadn't moved in straight away. It had taken almost a year to arrange things. Work, the flat in the city, the slow untangling of a life that had built up around her without her quite noticing. But eventually she had come, driven up on a gray Friday afternoon in late February with 2 suitcases and a box of books, and stood in the kitchen doorway breathing in the cold, still air of a house that had been waiting. It smelled of stone and old wood and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. She had named it later. It was the hives. The beehives sat at the far end of the garden, 3 of them, arranged in a loose row along the low stone wall that separated the garden from the meadow beyond. They were painted white, though the paint had weathered over the years to something softer. Cream in some patches, gray at the corners where rain had found a way in. They had been there as long as Clara could remember. Longer than that, probably. Her grandmother had kept bees for over 40 years. Had learned from a neighbor, she once said, a quiet man named Thomas, who had kept 50 hives on the hillside above the village and never once been stung. Clara had been stung twice already this summer. Once on the wrist, once on the back of the hand. Both times she had stood very still the way her grandmother taught her, breathing slowly, not slapping or flapping, just waiting for the moment to pass. And both times it had. That was June. Now it was August. The days had settled into a rhythm that felt nothing like her old life, and everything like something she had forgotten she needed. She woke early, usually just before 6, when the light was still thin and the birds were only just beginning. She would lie there for a few minutes listening, the wood pigeon in the oak at the garden's edge, the distant sound of the valley road, a car passing every now and then, the sound fading like a breath. The hives, on still mornings, had their own sound, a low, soft hum that wasn't quite music but wasn't quite not. She made tea first, always. The kettle on the old range, the good mug, the one with the chip on the handle she could never bring herself to throw away. She would stand at the kitchen window while it brewed and look out at the garden, the dew on the grass, the light coming in low from the east, finding the tops of things first, the wooden gate at the end of the path catching the early gold. Then she would go out. The mornings were hers in a way that afternoons never quite were. Afternoons had errands and tasks and the vague feeling that time was being measured. Mornings, out here, felt unmeasured. She moved through them slowly, and nothing asked her to go faster. The bees were usually already working by the time she reached the hives. August was a full month. The meadow was thick with clover and late wildflowers, and the foragers went out early and came back laden and went out again without pausing. She would stand a few feet away and watch them, just watch. Her grandmother had done the same. Clara remembered her standing exactly like that, hands loose at her sides, face calm, as if she were listening to something being said in a very low voice. She understood that now. There is a particular kind of quiet you find near a working hive. It is not silence. It is almost the opposite. The hum fills the air around you like warmth fills a room. It presses gently against you and asks nothing. You can stand in it for 10 minutes or 20 and come back to yourself feeling that time has done something useful, even if you couldn't say what. Clara had started talking to them. Not out loud, not always, sometimes just in her head. She would think at them, which felt slightly less foolish. "Good morning. How are you today?" That sort of thing. Her grandmother had talked to the bees as a matter of course and not shyly. Full sentences, said aloud in a calm voice. She had told them when family events happened, when there was a death, when there was a wedding. Clara had thought this was charming eccentricity until she'd read, years later, that the practice was ancient, telling the bees. It had a name, even. It had been taken seriously for a very long time by people who were not eccentric at all, just attentive. She had told them when she moved in, stood at the hives in her coat in late February, the grass white with frost, and said quietly that she was Edith's granddaughter, that she was going to try to look after them, that she hoped they would be patient with her. They had seemed, on balance, to accept this. The summer had taught her slowly. She'd bought books and read them carefully, making notes in the margins the way she always had with books that mattered. She'd found her grandmother's own notes in an old cardboard folder in the dresser drawer, pages of handwriting in faded blue ink, careful and neat, full of detail, dates and observations. The weight of the hives checked each week, which wildflowers were blooming, notes about the weather and how it affected the forager's mood. One entry from late July, some 15 years ago, that read simply, "They seem content today. The clover is very good." Clara had read that and sat still for a moment. She copied her grandmother's method of inspection. Slow movements, no sudden gestures, the smoker used sparingly. She had been nervous the first time, her hands not quite steady as she lifted the first frame. But they had been calm, busy and purposeful and entirely uninterested in her beyond a few curious guards who circled her veil and went back to work. The honey had come in well this year, better than she'd expected for a first season. She had harvested twice already, in July and again 3 weeks ago, and the jars now lined the shelf in the old dairy at the side of the house. 31 jars. She had counted them several times, not out of any practical reason, just because she liked to. The color of it was extraordinary. She had expected honey to be honey-colored, the amber gold of the jar on the windowsill, and it was that. But it was also deeper in places, darker in some jars than others, depending on which flowers had been worked that week. One batch had come out almost tawny, rich and dark, and when she had tasted it off the back of a spoon, it had something earthy in it, almost like the woods at the end of the lane smelled on a warm day. She had stood in the dairy with the spoon, trying to work out what she was tasting. It tasted like August. That was the closest she could get. The afternoons were different from the mornings, but no less good. Often she would take her lunch outside and sit on the old bench by the wall that still held the warmth of morning sun into the early afternoon. She ate simple things. Bread from the baker in the village 2 miles away, cheese, fruit, sometimes just a bowl of soup she'd made the day before. She had never cooked much in the city. There had never seemed to be time, or the right kitchen, or the right kind of hunger. Here she found herself thinking about food in a different way, thinking about it in advance, planning it in the gentle, abstract way she'd heard people describe but never quite experienced. She made jam. She pickled runner beans from the garden. She made a sauce from the tomatoes that grew in the lean-to greenhouse against the south wall, letting it reduce slowly on the range until it was thick and dark and intensely itself. These were small things, but small things, she was finding, were often the ones that accumulated into something that felt like a life. It had not always felt that way. She didn't think about the city years in any dramatic way. They weren't a wound. They were more like a room in a house you don't go into much anymore, that you pass on your way to other rooms and glance into without particularly wanting to enter. The work had been fine. She had been good at it, in the way you can be good at something that doesn't quite know you back. The flat had been comfortable. The years had passed without incident, which was not the same thing as passing well. She had not been unhappy. That felt important to say, even just to herself. She had not been unhappy. She had been, perhaps, slightly out of focus, like a photograph that's been taken with the lens not quite right. Everything there, every detail present, but none of it quite sharp. This felt sharper. She found herself noticing things she didn't used to notice. The way the light changed over the meadow in the hour before sunset, the smell of the air before rain, the particular sound of the gate at the end of the lane when the wind came from the south and pushed it gently against the latch, a soft rhythmic tap that she now found entirely comforting rather than something she should fix. She had tried to fix it twice. Both times she'd stood there with tools and then put them away again. Some things were doing what they were meant to do. The village was small enough that she had met most people within the first month. Not formally, not at some event or gathering, just in the way things happen in small places. At the baker's, at the post office counter on Tuesday mornings, on the lane when someone was walking a dog and you both slowed and said something about the weather. People knew who she was, or rather who she was connected to. Edith's granddaughter. That was enough. It came with a kind of inherited warmth, a goodwill she hadn't had to earn, which felt strange at first and then felt like grace. Margaret from the farm at the top of the hill had come by in April with a container of homemade soup and stayed for 2 cups of tea. She was in her late 60s, broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, and she had known Edith for 30 years. She talked about her grandmother in the easy way people talk about someone who has simply moved into a different room, not gone. As if Edith were still available somewhere, just not in the same place. Clara had found she liked that very much. Tom from the cottage at the end of the lane came past occasionally with his collie, pausing at the gate to exchange a few words about nothing much. The collie always looked through the bars toward the hives with focused, respectful attention, as if it understood something was happening in there that deserved acknowledgement. Tom was quiet, in the way that some men who have lived alone for a long time become quiet. Not sad quiet, just economical. He used words the way you'd use anything good that you didn't want to waste. He had said once, when she mentioned the bees were doing well, that Edith would be pleased. Not that she would have been pleased, that she would be. Clara had thought about that for days. Now it was a Tuesday evening in the middle of August, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with the window open and the last of the day's light moving slowly across the floor. The supper dishes were done. The range had been turned down to its evening setting and ticked softly to itself. She had a cup of tea she was only half concentrating on. The other half of her attention was on the jar on the windowsill. It had caught the low light in a particular way. The honey inside it glowed. That was the only word for it. Not brightly, gently. The way old amber glows when you hold it up to something warm. The light moved through it and came out the other side, the color of late summer afternoons. She picked it up for the first time in months. The glass was cool and smooth and pleasingly heavy. She turned it in her hands, watching the honey move, which it did very slowly. It was old honey. She had known that the way you know things about objects that have been in a place long enough, but she hadn't known how old until she found her grandmother's notes again last week, going through the folder more carefully. There was an entry dated September of some year in the 1980s, and it said simply, "Last batch before winter. Sealed 3 jars for keeping. One for Clara when she's old enough to want it." She had read that sentence 4 times. Then she had cried for a little while, which felt right, and not at all sad in the way she'd expected. It felt more like finding a letter that had been waiting in the right place all along, patient as stone. One for Clara when she's old enough to want it. She set the jar down softly and looked at it. 43, it turned out, was old enough. The sky outside the window had gone from gold to a pale amber of its own, the last color before the blue settled in for the night. The swallows that nested in the barn eaves had come back from their evening feed and were tucking themselves in. She could hear them briefly, a soft, liquid sound, and then they were still. The wood pigeon was already quiet. The garden was gathering itself. She thought about opening the jar. She had thought about it before and always stopped herself. It felt too final somehow, or perhaps she had been waiting without knowing what she was waiting for. You do that with things you're not ready for. You keep them sealed on a windowsill and walk past them every morning and tell yourself there is no hurry, which is true, but also occasionally a way of not being brave. The honey had waited for her, though. Decades of it. Whatever her grandmother had kept in it, whatever of the old meadow and the old summer and the old particular quality of those late 80s August afternoons, it had all been there, patient, while Clara went away to school and university in the city, and the years that had not been unhappy but had not been quite in focus. It had waited. She stood and found a spoon in the drawer, a small one, the kind you use for jam. She came back to the table and sat down with the jar in front of her. The seal was old wax, still intact. She worked at it carefully with her thumbnail. not wanting to rush it. It gave way slowly, and then all at once, the way old things give way. She felt the faintest breath of air release, and the smell that came with it was extraordinary. Honey, yes, of course, but underneath and around it, something else. Flowers she couldn't name. Warmth, grass in the sun, something faintly woody, something green. She closed her eyes and breathed it in. She could almost feel the summer of it. The long summer of 35 years ago, the meadow in full bloom, the old white hives warm under the afternoon sun, her grandmother moving among them in that calm, unhurried way. The light that always seemed to stay longer there than anywhere else. The stone flags warm under bare feet. The sound of bees, always the sound of bees. She opened her eyes, dipped the spoon in slowly, lifted it, let it settle, and tasted. It was extraordinary. Rich and floral and somehow also deep. The way old things get deep. It had a particular density to it that fresh honey doesn't quite have. Like a flavor that has had time to think about what it wants to be and has made its decision. She held it on her tongue and let it dissolve slowly. She thought, there it is, 35 years in a jar on a windowsill, a summer kept in glass. Her grandmother's hands, and her grandmother's garden, and the meadow that was still outside, the same meadow, older, but essentially the same clover probably, the same lineage of bees, because hives don't end, they continue, each colony the inheritor of the last, going back and back and back through summers she would never know. She sat with the open jar and the small spoon and the last of the evening light for a long time. It was the kind of stillness that you don't arrange. You can't. It just arrives, sometimes, when the conditions are right, when you've been patient enough, when you've come far enough back to yourself that the quiet doesn't feel like absence anymore, just presence in a different form. She thought about her grandmother, not with the sadness of missing, but with something warmer. Gratitude, partly. The sense of someone having thought of her from a long way away and arranged something careful and kind, but also something simpler. Just love. The ordinary, enduring kind that doesn't announce itself but leaves a jar of honey on a windowsill for 35 years in case you need it. Outside, the first stars were beginning in the east. Not many yet, just the early ones, the ones that arrive before the rest like they're setting things up. The air coming through the window had cooled and carried with it the smell of the garden in the evening, the grass and the stone and the very faint sweetness that she now recognized without thinking. The hives were quiet. They always went quiet around this time. The foragers all home, the work of the day wound down, the colony settling into its slow evening rhythm. She had read that they didn't fully sleep the way other creatures slept, but moved into a kind of collective rest, a gentle metabolic quieting. She liked to think of them in there in the dark, warm against each other, the whole mass of them breathing very slowly together. She sealed the jar again as best she could, pressed the wax back down with her thumb, not perfectly, but well enough. She set it back on the windowsill where it had always been. She wasn't sure what had shifted. Something had, in the quiet way things shift when you're not watching for it. She felt lighter, maybe, but that wasn't quite the word. Settled was closer. Like something that had been resting against a wall at a slight angle had found its proper vertical. small, not dramatic at all, but real. She rinsed the spoon and left it on the side and turned down the kitchen light to the low, warm setting she used in the evenings. Made her way out through the back door into the garden. The night air was warm and soft and full of the smell of the late summer. She walked slowly down the path to the hives and stood in front of them the way she always did. The stone wall behind them was still holding a little of the day's heat. She could feel it at her back. No sound from the hives now, just the faint, breathing sense of something alive and settled. She stood there for a while, not thinking much, not needing to. Then she said, quietly, to no one and to all of them, "I think I understand now." Whether that was true or not, whether she could have said what it was she understood, seemed less important than the saying of it. Some things want to be spoken, even just into the dark. They don't need a listener. They just need to be released. She stood until the dew began to settle on her shoulders, and then she went inside. She slept better that night than she had in months. The bedroom window was open just enough to let in the garden sounds and the cool air that came off the hills after midnight. She lay on her back in the dark and felt the day unwind from her shoulders and her chest, slowly and completely, the way fatigue does when you have earned it honestly. The last thing she heard before she slept was the low, barely there hum from the end of the garden. Still working, still keeping something, just as they always had. In the morning she was up before 6 again, the sky pale and unwritten, the birds beginning their first uncertain notes. She put the kettle on and stood at the window with her hands loose at her sides. The jar on the windowsill caught no light yet. The sun was too low and too new. But she looked at it differently now, not as something sealed and waiting, but as something that had already done what it was meant to do. She had always thought of grief as a kind of emptying, the removing of something that had been there and now was not. But standing in the early kitchen with the kettle beginning to make its preparatory sounds, she thought that some of it was more like the opposite, a filling in, an arrival, things coming to rest in the spaces that had been kept for them, quiet as honey finding its level. She made her tea and went outside. The garden was still and wet with dew. Her boots left dark prints in the grass as she walked down to the hives. The sun was just finding the top of the stone wall, the light still thin and horizontal and full of long shadows. The meadow beyond was beginning to show its colors, the greens and golds separating themselves from the general gray of earliest morning. The foragers were already going. She watched them for a while, the small, determined bodies navigating the air between the hive entrance and the meadow, purposeful and without fuss. They didn't need direction. They didn't need instruction. They simply knew, or had inherited the knowing, or had learned it so thoroughly that knowing and being had become the same thing. She thought there was something in that. The summer had more days in it yet. The clover would hold for another few weeks, and then the heather on the high slopes would start, and there would be one more harvest before autumn asked them all to slow down and prepare. She had already thought about where the new jars would go, whether there was room on the dairy shelf or whether she needed another one put up. She had thought about writing her own notes to add to her grandmother's folder, continuing the same small record, dates and observations, the weight of the hive, the mood of the foragers, what the meadow was doing. She had thought about writing simply, "I think they are content." The clover is very good. Not yet, but soon. She stayed at the hives until the sun had risen enough to warm her neck, and then she went back inside to start the day, unhurried, the garden quiet behind her, the hum of the bees steady and low and unbroken as it had always been, as it would go on being, long after the morning and the season and even the particular summer that had, without her quite planning it, brought her finally home.